I, just good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to Australia. I wish I could be there in person, but we'll do it by Zoom this time and maybe get together in person another time. That presentation was amazing, Tanya, and as you said, so many echoes between the two groups of participants in our surveys in terms of news engagement. So I'm going to highlight those and talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. I want to give you a bit of context. I'm speaking from the territory of the Lekwungen people, and I acknowledge with respect the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with these lands and waters continue to this day. I'm going to be presenting the work of Project Information Literacy, an institute led by the incomparable Alison Head, who has conducting groundbreaking studies of how students use information in their academic, personal, and professional lives. I'm now a senior researcher with PIL after spending a lot of years in academic libraries. And I worked for the last part of my career with journalism and other communication students. So I've been at the intersection of journalism and information literacy for a while now. And when PIL conceived of this news study, I was really lucky to get in on the ground floor and to be a part of it. So I'm going to talk about two studies and the links between them. I'm going to talk about the news study and some information that came out of that and how that information fed into our COVID-19 series, which is essentially a news literacy package that can be used with college students and I believe with high school students as well. So I'm not going to go into detail on the two studies. They're both online. All of PIL's work is open access. I am just going to draw out some of the material from the news study first and then see how it translated into the COVID-19 series. But I'm happy to answer questions offline about either one. So the news study, it was big. And as I said, there's so many echoes with the study that Tanya's just presented from Australia. I was struck by two things. When I read it first, I was struck by the similarities and I was struck by how very smart the questions were. And I wish I could redo our study in a way and go back and reuse some of her questions. What stood out for me was the difference between the key source of family in the younger group and the key source of peers. And I think that's a natural evolution that comes with aging through and into university and perhaps leaving home. But I think that gives us something as educators to think about, because how do we support students as they change from one news community to another? How do we support them in becoming participants in that community and leaders in that community and sources in that community? Beyond that, there were tons of shared characteristics. As Tanya says, I think we finally put to bed the myth of the apathetic youth when it comes to news. Our students were highly engaged with news several times a day, several different sources per day, and talked about it in the comments in the survey, it impacting them 24/7. Something else that I think our surveys both highlighted was the importance of visual news sources. So we saw Instagram and YouTube seeing a very high rate of usage, and Snapchat as well. And in a small part of our survey where we looked at high school students, so there was some overlap in age group with the Australian students, that Instagram, Snapchat, and YouTube really advanced into a much higher rate of use. So it gives us a sense of what's coming, I think. And that's something to think about as we think about teaching, right? Is how often do we actually talk about visual literacy in terms of news? I know I didn't a lot when I was teaching, apart from a couple of things with photojournalism students, but I think it's something that we need to think about incorporating. It struck me as well that both groups had a lack of trust in news organizations and in friends as news sources. I'm going to talk more about that lack of trust, but I think we have to think about where that comes from, right? And as it showed in the Australian study, I think part of it is the lack of representation of young people in the news and lack of consideration for them as an audience. But I think maybe it might have to do with a lot of adults, teachers, media, maybe even librarians telling students that news is unreliable, that it's not a source that's good enough to be used in academia. And I think we need to think about how we talk about the news in our own classrooms. And so we've got this content, both text and visual news, that students are really, really interested in, and we don't teach a whole lot about it. So I think there's a real missed opportunity there for us, not just librarians. It can't just be down to us. It has to be through the curriculum and across the curriculum and interdisciplinary in how to engage with news and how to relate to news and how to absorb news and become a participant in news communities. So we pulled out a number of themes, and I'm just going to give you a sense, time to read the quotation because I need a drink of water. But have a look and see where you can see these themes in that quotation from one student. Right? So as Tanya says, news is important. This is a lot of words for a student to spend in a comment about how they engage with news. It's social. They're heavily influenced by what their peers are discussing, so that socially mediated news is right there in the quotation. It's biased. They're worried about accuracy of the reporting. News is work. They have to analyze 4 or 5 articles just to get the sense of one story. And what's not here, but came out in other ways in our materials, was that news is visual, highly visual. So I'm going to pull these themes out and talk a little bit more about each one of them. So news was important. News was important both in a general motherhood sense. News is necessary in a democracy, and slightly closer to home, following news as a civic responsibility. But news was also really important on a far more personal level. So we asked, when you share news items, so not just the verification that you do for reading a news item, but when you're sharing a news item, why do you do it? And if we look at the responses, some of the responses, friends and followers know something that I think that they should know, and that's very familiar after Tanya's talk. A way to have a voice about a larger cause in the world. And again, we heard that from the younger population as well. And an opportunity to help change the views of my friends and followers. So this tells me that participating in news and sharing news is not just about belonging to a community, it's also about becoming a leader in that community. And so this is a real leverage point, and it's something that I think we can take advantage of when we start thinking about teaching about the news, because other research has shown that one of the things that's very important as students develop is the construction of self as expert, to become a source of information. And I think if we consider news literacy as not just reading the news better, but also disseminating and being a source for news, that's more informed. I think that's another way of leveling up our game a little bit. News is social. This isn't the whole graph about where students got their news. We were surprised by peers. We thought social media would be way out in front, but peers were the top. Professors, also a significant source of news, I think probably more than they know as a source of news. And the reason social media has that particolor on it is because in the comments, students were really careful to say that some of their social media consumption of news was from friends and from celebrities, and other consumption was from mainstream journalism sites, from journalists that they followed on Twitter or on Facebook. And so they were very careful to make that distinction and to carry through with that distinction in how credible that they found the news and what their credibility decisions were around social media news. So again, what this tells me is we need to think about news as a social activity, and we need to think about professors as a vector for news. Tanya might have asked about librarians in her survey. We did, not so much, as it turns out. librarians weren't seen as a major source of news overall. And when I think about it, I don't know that students would have come to me as a source of news in the classroom unless they needed to find historical or retrospective news. So, news is biased. It was interesting when I read Tanya's survey that the bias that the students were talking about was around gender and around race. In the comments from our students, their construction of bias, and this may be because it was a US population, was around politics, around the right and left split, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative split. And that showed up in the comments where students who had identified as leaning towards the liberals said that Fox was fake news. Students who identified as leaning conservative said that CNN was fake news. So there was a real political flavor in the bias. They felt that not only were mainstream media organizations biased for both political and corporate reasons, money played a big role in that, but also that the news that they were getting from their profs and from their peers was biased. There were discussions where a student would say, I don't normally use this news source, but it's the one my prof likes, so it's the one that I'll use in a class. I think there's some interesting news here and some conflict. This is why I said it's complicated. Journalists deliberately insert their own bias into news stories, about half, but 3/4 still trust their news from traditional sources more than from social media. So it's a very complicated relationship with bias in the news. And I think discussions in the United States, remember, this is 2018 that we did the work, Trump was in office, news was getting increasingly polarized, and accusations of fake news were being thrown out hourly, I think. We saw this as well. The fake news has made me distrust the credibility of news and the lack of trust in news per se. Fake news a little bit more. We did ask how confident they felt in recognizing fake news. Fairly small from this very confident group. Felt confident in determining that. There were a lot of comments, as I said, with fake news. And what I saw also in the comments was a lot of strategies and a lot of work around verifying news and seeking to balance news. There was that, a lot of activity around verifying, trying to go to a source or a different source to find the true story. And then there was also political balancing, where they would look for sources from a different political perspective than where they had first read the story. So a lot of concern about fake news, but also a lot of good work going on in terms of trying to ameliorate the situation. Which leads me to news is work, right? For these students, news wasn't a leisure activity. News is work. We asked the question, how do you evaluate the quality of information before you share? I don't do all of these before I share it. I've been doing social media for a long time. There are a number of things that I think are good news for those of us who teach information literacy. A lot of skills that we can build on, checking the currency, comparing and fact-checking news items using other sources. But there's also a lot of socially mediated work going on. This taking a screenshot of the news item to ask a friend what they think is very much like one of the strategies in Tanya's survey. But there's a lot of use of the affordances of the technology. So using who posted an item, how many comments, how many tweets, how many times a news item was liked, using those markers that are built into social media and also on other news sites, was seen as a valid strategy for determining whether something was good enough to share. Students also in the comments talked about a divide along topic lines. So if it was something about a celebrity, they didn't do as much checking. If it was something for school, they would do more checking. Or if it was something where they already had kind of a reputation for expertise among their peers, they would be very careful about the information that they passed along. So there were levels of checking. And again, this is all self-reported. This is what they say they're doing. This isn't objectively checked as to what they really are doing. And so I started to think about this, and I thought about it as, how is this different? And what I'd like you to think about is, put yourself back in your 18-year-old shoes. They'll still fit. And what was news like for you when you were in university? If you engage with news at all, some of my peers did not, right? I got it once or twice a day at my choice. I controlled whether I saw the newspaper or listened to the radio news or stopped by where there was a television. Right? News at that time, this is the 80s, was trusted, more or less, and centrist, more or less, in Canada at the time. There are issues with that, and there are issues with the voices and the audience that news was for, but the overall societal view of news was that it was trustworthy, right? It was local. And I was fascinated by the video, Tanya, of how much importance the students placed on news for giving them a global vision and an international vision. And I think that's totally different from my perspective. Yes, there was international news, but it was only if it was a really big story. Most of the news I had local context with, and that helped me judge its importance, its truthfulness. The news I saw was curated by editors, and it was curated by editors on behalf of a community and to some extent, to make communities more cohesive, right? This is totally different now. And it was passive. I might have clipped an article out and pinned it to somebody's bulletin board. That's as close to sharing news as I might have gotten, or discussed it face-to-face with somebody where it wasn't going to be on the web forever and ever and ever. So I am proposing a new unit of measure of work per story. Right? So the work I had to do per story was read, hear, watch one article, and I felt I was done. So how is that different for students now, right? It's 24/7. One of our student comments said that news throws its ugly face at you on the daily, and it's even more often than that. News is by default untrustworthy. They're being told all the time that news is not trustworthy, that it's fake, that it's biased, and it's polarized. It's global. News is coming at them from all over the world all the time, and they don't have necessarily the context and the background to determine what's important or to find other ways of balancing that out. News is now curated by algorithms. Tanya alluded to this, and it's curated by algorithms at an atomistic level and targeted towards individuals. So when news previously was developed for a community, news curated by algorithms is really against community to some extent. It's pushing people apart. And it's active. This is an active engagement with news. So the work per story measurement is they have to engage with multiple articles, multiple formats, perhaps multiple perspectives, multiple peers. They have to decide if they trust it. How much do they trust it? Do they trust it enough to pass it on to a friend, post it on Facebook? Do they trust it enough to use it academically? Do they accept it or not? Do they post it? If they post it, where do they post it? What do they do around it? But Tanya alluded to the work that they put around that posting. What emoji do they put with it, right? How do they translate it into a meme? So it's a totally different experience for news today. And I'm guessing some people aren't as separated in time from their students as I was, but it really helped me when I was working with the students to think about news as being different for them. And I think we need to build that into our teaching as to whose news are we building for? Whose news experience are we meeting? And finally, news is visual. So we did ask which particular social media work did you look at? And as I said, our younger group of students, the Snapchat and the YouTube and the Instagram were even higher than our university students. But where we got a real insight into how important visuals were in the news was in a question about the types of news that students engage with and the types that they shared. So we ran a pilot, we tested our questions with a group of students that weren't in the actual study. And we said, you know, these are our types of news: traffic, weather, politics, environment, science, medicine. And the students said, wait a minute, you're missing something that's really important to us. You're missing memes, you're missing political memes. And for us, that's an important news source. That's where we think about news. So we said, okay, we'll add it, why not? 82% engaged with political memes in the previous week. That was third after just traffic and weather and national politics in the age of Trump. And when we asked, what did you share? Political memes blew everything else out of the water. They were number one. So what does that mean for us as teachers? Well, the quote kind of gives a clue, right? I didn't pay attention to memes unless I see them, and then I proceed to do research to see fact versus fiction, opinion versus reality. Call me crazy, but that sounds like a really good information literacy activity. So political memes may just be the gateway drug we're looking for news literacy, right? They may be a way in, a powerful way in that allows us to engage with news content and talk about visual content at the same time, and perhaps encourage students to do the kind of digging around before they share this incredibly, eminently shareable type of information. We did ask students the difference between what they used for academic and what they used for personal. There's a lot of other bars in between this one. These are the top and bottom. It was almost a complete mirror image. So the ones that they use most for class, like library databases, not at all for personal life. So we spend a lot of time teaching this, which students often don't have access to after they leave school. And I spent very little time teaching this. And that's where they're getting the news and how they're getting their news, and how they're being able to engage with news in ways that go beyond school and education. One of the few places where there was actually a fairly close number was professors' recommendations. And again, I'm not sure that professors know how critical their views are. I think it's similar to what Tanya said, that parents were filters for information and telling the students what was important enough to pay attention to and what to look at. And I think the professors play a similar role in that they signal what's important and what's not important and act as a kind of filter. And so I think one of the things that we need to think about is how can we use this more to perhaps make information literacy relating to news a little more widespread. Not all professors though. I'm gonna let you read this one as well because I'm dry again. So this computer science major thinks that history and science teachers might have a better idea of the credibility of news, which I thought was interesting. Right. So that's the news study. And we worked on that, and we're still learning things from the news study and still developing materials from it. But then COVID happened, as we all know. And we looked at this incredible news event that had some commonalities across international bounds, certainly commonalities across the United States. And we saw it as a possible place where we could make news a subject of study because there was an agreed on, perhaps, body of news. We thought that we might help build instructor agency by providing some materials that helped people learn how to teach about the news. Provide ways into the news, provide questions to ask about the news for people who might not be used to that. We also wanted to build student agency. So a lot of our questions are designed to prompt reflection, discussion, to leverage that social mediation of news, and to get them to take a bit of a step back from the onslaught of individual articles and to look at the news as systems and reflective of social systems. So to give them a bit of emotional distance, perhaps, as they worked through the news. And we also wanted to build skills in asking questions, because PIL has, in many studies, determined that the biggest trouble that students have in doing research is finding a good question to start with. And so we thought, well, if we can perhaps build some information around asking questions of the news, that might be useful beyond COVID and beyond news literacy as well. So instead of writing our usual really long reports with many, many references written for professionals, we developed 2 reports, very brief for us, written for students so they could be consumed immediately in the classroom. We made sure that they were highly visual and interactive so that they're not just static reports, because we had seen that instruction in March was moving completely online. So we wanted to make something that wasn't just reading yet another PDF, something that students could interact with. We wanted to pay attention to affect. We were seeing a lot in Twitter and elsewhere of the emotional toll that the news was taking on students. And we wanted to try and unpack that a little bit and maybe give them a way of getting some distance from it. And we also wanted to scaffold deeper engagement. I love Tanya's statement about meeting the students where they are, and then giving them the tools to take it deeper and to develop a wider understanding of the news and a deeper understanding of the news. And I'm just going to pop into the graph for this one. So this is a wonderful graph that Stephen Braun made, and this is how news stories took off in US news sites in the first 100 days. And along the bottom, there's a timeline so students can reference major events as they happen and see news bubbles in response to those. For each day, we randomly pulled stories from the top 12 news sources in the US. And because many of these sources let their information go outside the paywall, if it was related to COVID, we could actually provide live links so that students had a tool where they could have a look at the news, find a day that interested them, pick some stories from the day. And what we did based on this graph was we developed a whole bunch of questions around the report that first of all asked students what their memories and their impressions of the news were. So relating it to their own experience. And then took them a little bit broader, saying, here's what we found. What do you find interesting? Follow your curiosity in the graphs, both figure 1 and figure 2. And then we took them deeper into questions of representation, of audience, of what do the kinds of stories in a particular news source tell you about who it anticipates are reading them, who's left in, who's left out, how are they portrayed. So we allow for different levels depending on where the students are at for gaining entrance into this information. And I have to thank Stephen Braun, who's on our team. He is amazing to work with and develop these graphics. And I would encourage you to go to the live site and play around with them, maybe not right now, but tomorrow. In the second report, we were a little bit more directive because it's about visuals, and we'd heard from colleagues in information literacy that visual literacy was something that not everybody felt as comfortable with. And we also saw it as a place to add in some explicit content around emotions. And so we coded pictures in our sample set for emotion and asked some questions around the emotion in images. And then in the report, there's a series of images that we actually went and got the copyright for, and we gave them some of the codes that we use for visual techniques. So in essence, what we did was try and give the students a bit of a language to say, okay, this picture makes you feel a certain way. That's fine. Let's take a step back and think about how it's making you and why it's making you that feel way, and look at some of the photographic techniques. And in the report, we go into a little bit about how the choices that the photojournalist makes and then the choices that the editor makes are based on wanting to create particular impressions and particular perspectives. And so we talked a little bit more directively about that. And we also gave students instructions in how to use a tool called TinEye for image verification, and wrote a number of questions around how you can use TinEye to find out more about how an image is being used and where else it's being used, and to get a sense of what editors want to do with that image. So again, taking a step back, giving them some tools. So that's a really quick run through a couple of fairly complex studies, but in some, news is important. We built the COVID teaching resources on the sure knowledge that the students were engaged with news and that they would be interested enough to learn more about the news and how it shaped society and understanding, and how students shape the news as well. So it's that Mobius strip. News is social, and so our questions are really based around discussion and discussion questions with their peers, and taking it out to discussing it with people in other groups to look at how news is socially constructed and how the news constructs society. We acknowledge the bias in news, and we took it a little bit deeper to say, okay, you say news is biased. Well, let's look at how it's biased. Let's look at representation. Let's look at audiences. And we brought in professional codes of ethics so that students could have a look at what journalism organizations say that they're playing by, and to judge the work against that kind of standard. And we know that news is work. And so we gave them maybe some more tools for how to do that work effectively, both verification, ways of comparing, ways of thinking about the news, ways of talking about the news, and particularly where news is visual, ways of interpreting and interrogating affect in the news, and just giving them some tools and language to do that in a series of learning resources that accompany each report. And thank you. Thank you to the LARC community. Thank you to Tanya Notley for doing amazing work. One of the reasons that our studies work so well together is there was considerable overlap between the teams for the news study and for the COVID series, so that those of us working on both, we knew that news study inside out as we were developing the COVID resources. And also Allison Head is amazing. She is a journalist. She's an expert social researcher, and she's an expert in information literacy. So having that multiple background really allowed us to say, is what we're saying about news true? Is what we're saying about information literacy true? And how are we making those connections? And I added this in because really, is it a library session without a Venn diagram? I'm not sure anymore. Thank you.
Thank